But first, a word from our sponsor.
Have you ever thought about making your own podcast? Okay, so you have your script, you're ready to record. So now what? Anchor, a podcasting platform, can come to your rescue. I use it for my podcasts because of the ease of having Anchor distribute my episodes on other podcasting platforms, such as Spotify and Apple Podcast. It's a free platform with its own creation tools that make it easy for you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. And the best part? You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. Now that's a good deal. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Anchor.fm is everything you need to make a podcast, all in one place.
And now, on with the show.
There is a pleasure in the pathless woods. There is a rapture on the lonely shore. There is society where none intrudes, by the deep sea and music in its roar. I love not man less, but nature more. A college education can ensure you understand and remember our own human history, of the terrible things we have done as a species. Knowing this, and realising the abusive power of repeating our mistakes, as you, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, learning everything you can, to suddenly come of age and not be supported from the education system anymore. You are about to go off into the world. With that knowledge, what would you do with it? Based on documented photographs and journal entries that eventually made this movie, Chris McCandless makes a conscious decision to not follow the herd, but go against his upbringing, his family's values and expectations and go, with no money, identity, or phone. In this isolation, there becomes an urge to fight off the subtle attraction of any human contact, of any wanting of human connection through relationships. It can be shown how easy it is for a stranger to become a friend, and how hard it is for a family to forget you. Chris McCandless wanted something more, an attempt to find a natural state of being, and what better than in the wilderness? To find your childlike wander through the lonely roads and release it back into the wild. You never know, something might talk back. This is 2 takes, and this is 1 shot, an analysis of the film Into the Wild. Please note, there will be spoilers throughout. From the beginning of the film that represents a nuclear family unit, we are introduced to the panic from the mother, the guilt and anger from the father, and the sadness from the daughter/sister that are enacted when Chris has chosen to leave. The effect is like a butterfly effect, reacting from one person to the next. An example is within the first presentation of Chris's mother, who unfortunately wakes up in the middle of the night from her dreams exclaiming that she heard Chris shouting out. She's upset, distraught, and has to be comforted. The choice of leaving behind his family with no to explanation plays the role of the unknown in many aspects, such as the obvious things, his whereabouts, and not so obvious, his intention of leaving. The aspect of the unknown, in this case, the unknown condition and location of Chris, could trigger behaviours such as the distraught mother waking up from her dreams, and the father, in another scene, breaking down and crying in the middle of the street. These scenes, before and after the explanation of why Chris has left, still gives rise to the sadness of a son leaving their parents. The safety and security that they could offer was not enough, or not wanted. And though they might have thought Chris was going through a difficult stage in his life by always battling with his parents about, for example, materialistic things, shown in the scene when he just graduated, we see that their love is there, and it's never faded, nor went away. Their distress about their son leaving, or rather, his planned disappearance, makes the love become more raw, emotions become more passionate, and in their loss, their togetherness becomes more solid. And it is within Chris's misfortune that he does not see this. Through Chris's journey, it seems that there are many people that have presented themselves as available and willing to help a complete stranger. And through their interactions we see, as the audience, that it's almost like learning lessons through communication. There are always choices to be made, and these people that Chris lets in, if even for a brief moment, emphasize a new state of being, a new thought pattern that Chris learns about and perhaps even practices. Let's take a look. It is strange but a beautiful thing that the film has chosen to begin by Chris's trek through the snow after being dropped off at a certain location. Why? Because the first person you see that wants to help Chris is actually the last person to see him alive. This person, like we will eventually see throughout the movie with almost everyone else, gives him contact information, another way, another path, another choice, from the one he wants. And as driven or as stubborn, depending on how you perceive it, Chris thanks them and moves on. His persistence drives him towards his goal, which he gets to. But what is more interesting is his thoughts about this, from the beginning of his journey right to the end. When he gets to the magic bus, we see him carving in wood with almost a fevered passion. The words, battling of destroying the false being within for a spiritual revolution, no longer to be poisoned by civilization he leaves, and walks alone in the land to become lost in the wild. Alexander Supertramp, May 1992. What is interesting is that these thoughts in the first instance of the film give the intention that Chris, or as he wants to call himself, his alias Alexander, is this young passionate man that wants to find a spiritual peace through a revolution, but rejecting certain ideals and make room for the ones that he wants. It's almost as if he's still fighting, like he did with his family, with these aggressive words such as destroying and poisoned, perhaps emphasise that he feels towards society within his confined childhood and family unit. It is a worrying thought, as his want of spiritual realisation shouldn't be seen as anything other than a personal journey. At this instance, Chris has the right idea, but is projecting the wrong principle. But who can blame him? Reflecting back towards what he's learning in his education, or his obligated graduation, and how the potential of university has just opened up more reasons and more research into world affairs that eventually made Chris decide to leave. The more research he had under his belt, the more reasons there were not to stay. This journey, with these carved thoughts seen as his first in the film, are actually projected as his last. Well, almost. The carvings show a reflection of Chris within himself. These ideas are still there throughout the film, and with each interaction he projects them. However, within the time frame he has, where he is absolutely alone in the magic bus, these thoughts have enough time to simmer and quiet down. The conversations that he has with other people come forth, and for their efforts of understanding and sharing their ideals and thoughts, open up Chris's mind in a whole new different way. So half the time, when we first see him in the complete wild, is at the end of the journey, is the time to essentially survive and reflect. And in this solitude, we discover that the words he has carved become the opposite of what he finds. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's go through the interactions. The story is told in chapters, with titles that project a new being coming to their own. Chapter 1 is named My Own Birth. In this first chapter, we find Chris has just left, packed everything he needs and has burnt any trace of himself, meaning any kind of identification and money that could potentially help him. After the initial first interaction that we see in the movie, his actual first interaction is with a couple called Rainey and Jan. They describe themselves as rubber tramps and explain their difference in lifestyle. They saw him hitchhiking, offering him a ride, food, shelter, and company. The main aspect of this couple is the loss of their son, to whom did almost the exact same thing Chris has done to his family. Their loss, and perhaps grief, has them sharing everything they have with Chris on the basis of perhaps filling a hole in their small broken family. That is their story. And Chris's, at this moment, is one all about quoting books and referencing things that support his arguments about the aspect of freedom and liberation. He's not letting anyone in with a difference of opinion. And when they ask where his parents are, Chris responds, living their lives somewhere, making it a point that he will not be swayed in his act of rebellion. This questioning perhaps lets Chris be aware of the fact that he was only thinking of himself and his own freedom, not realising how this might impact others. All in all, they give the illusion of caring parents, and in turn, Chris helps them open up to each other about their past and how to mend it through being strong within oneself. An act that supposedly Chris is well aware of and has been practicing throughout his childhood. There is a sharing of information and compassion within this interaction, which gives a good beginning to the story. In the second chapter, named Adolescence, we find Chris working as a wheat farmer in the fields of Dakota in September 1990 under Wayne, his boss and friend. Chris finds himself enjoying this good honest job within manual labour, because there might be more freeing to work with the land around oneself, whilst being on the fringes of society. This aspect of being on the fringe is later recalled when Chris, Wayne, and the other workers are at a bar, and we see Chris on the piano whilst everyone else is dancing. The image there suggests his position within society, willing to be there, but unwilling to participate. His conversation with Wayne in the bar, after some beers, is even more passionate about the act of liberation and freedom. He talks about how judgmental and controlling society is, giving examples like parents and hypocrites, in that order I might add, which hint to Wayne about Chris's position within life. It seems it's harder than we thought to hide what we want to hide, as this is the second time that someone asks about what Chris is doing, trying to dissuade him, not because they wish to restrain him, like his parents, but more on the aspect of safety and care for him as an individual. But Chris resists, and after Wayne is taken away, his good influence is shattered. Though, throughout the film, we do see Chris writing to Wayne in prison about his thoughts, where he is on his journey. But there is more in this chapter than these interactions. It is here that the sister, Corinne, reveals to the audience about her and Chris's past. All in all, their upbringing was tainted because of the knowledge that Chris has found out about his parents. His father was already married with another family, with a wife and a child, making Chris's mother the mistress. And so, Chris's parents invent a story of their love and lied throughout their marriage to their children about how they met. I guess the disgust of what his father did, disregard of his other wife and the child, made Chris question his father's intentions about whether or not he can love, and whether his own restrictions from his guilt had channeled down to his children in the form of parental control. Who knows? But how would you react to this? This piece of information justifies Chris's reactions and passions, and like many movies, they give this information a little later for the audience to decide for themselves. Tell me, did you judge too quickly? It seems some things are harder to forget, especially when it's a thought about something, such as Chris's view on society. This is still rampant in his mind. Even though there is help available, Chris decides not to take it. This can be seen in the moment Chris applies for a bed for the homeless, and then does not take it, after seeing someone that looks like him in a flashy suit laughing in a bar. That could have been him, and perhaps in that instance, Chris refuses the help because he feels he might fall down the trap of reliance within the society. Or perhaps he feels that he hasn't finished his journey yet. Both might be correct. There are those moments when we see Chris deciding to place himself in danger of the elements, such as sleeping on the streets, because of the necessity of freedom. However, in another scene, just before, Chris has wanted to know the way of kayaking down a river, whilst the supervisor begrudgingly informs him that he needs a permit and the next available slot is in 12 months' time. This scene shows us the ridiculousness of the society and its never-ending rules and regulations. So, there are two sides to the coin when presenting an ideal. We need company, food, and shelter. More people in a place make a society where ideas are formed and discussed, but also where freedoms are minimized for the conformity of giving and taking. Taking a permit to kayak down a river is probably presented for the safety of the kayaker if anything goes wrong, but having to wait a year to do so is where it becomes stupid. A river is a river. It's not a man-made structure until we believe we own it, which we do not. And so, Chris does it anyway, and goes all the way to Mexico. Chapter 3, named Manhood, is about Chris back in the magic bus killing a moose and losing the meat to flies and maggots because of the lack of skill required to keep it fresh. The loss of the moose's life is a difficult aspect, as he must actually kill a living being for food. A very different outlook from simply buying the meat at a supermarket. It's another building block of survival, and Chris is saddened by it, calling it one of my greatest tragedies of his life. It gets worse when the meat is ruined, as Chris unconsciously flips back to his memories of his father belittling his mother at a barbecue, and through his frustration starts shouting what his father says. This in itself shows the audience how his parents' interactions have affected Chris's coping mechanisms, and that there are still some deep-seated family issues that would be best resolved. As memories, through time, will never fully go away, even if one escapes, it's not through different surroundings that the inner voice grows quiet, it's through self-reflection. Perhaps a reason for this chapter is called Manhood is to reflect upon what really makes a man, in a sense. The American pastime, for many, not for all, is where it would be to play catch or to kill something with your father, perhaps? But without the dramatization of it all, let's just say it might be called that because it could be a test or an obstacle that one has to go through to become their own sense, a man in their own right. Chris, in his, was to kill another for the survival of himself, and with that killing came demons of his own failures. Another test. In Chapter 4, Family, the timeline skips back to Slab City in December 1991 before the Magic Bus. It is here that Rainey and Jan make a more prominent appearance, giving the absolute indication of being like a family, being like a friendly stepmother and father. They care about Chris, without any judgment or expectations, and this is where the back and forth of caring comes into play. Rainey and Jan discuss in depth their son and their feelings about it, remembering it how it almost happening again with Chris and what it has done to his family. It was almost as if they are outside of the situation looking in, remembering how it happened to them, and instead of being bystanders, they are more concerned, keeping a level of cool, of course. Jan gives more of a motherly protection outward towards Chris because of the absence of her son. It is here that we see strangers becoming almost like family overnight. It's in the aspect of family that there is more than one type, because in this chapter we are introduced to a potential love interest named Tracy. She likes Chris so much that she wants to lose her virginity to him. Chris is understandable and rejects her, instead decides to sing with her on stage. This kind of understanding and relationship, that could be developed or broken because of the complicated nature of sex or anything physical, presents boundaries, whereas caring for someone can surpass that and go deeper than just their physical aspect. And because of this, Tracy likes Chris for who he is, not for what he looks like, and so a potential big brother prospect can blossom. But again, like many things, Chris decides that this isn't enough, having the ideal being something bigger and something that only he can experience within the isolation of the wild. In the final chapter, named Getting of Wisdom, it has Chris meeting Ron Franz, an elderly gentleman who has set himself in his own little bubble because of the things outside of his control. He tells the story to Chris, explaining that his wife and child got killed by a drunk driver, so he became an alcoholic in his grief. After a while, Ron realised that this was not helping him anymore, and so stopped drinking and began doing hobbies such as leather work, whilst he got his pension. A small world for someone, but it was enough. Chris, the complete opposite, lies about his background, saying that he doesn't have a family anymore. The questioning from Ron about Chris's life is quite aggressive, and Chris is more than happy to answer them, creating a story that sometimes is true and sometimes is not. Why the lying, you might ask? Well, perhaps that is a transitioning point for Chris, to believe his own lies about the fact that he doesn't have a family anymore. He wants that, perhaps, to not have a family, but there is a potential for a new one that is more favourable. A runaway kid that lies about his family is not something new after all. If you could fabricate a new history of yourself, would you? It would certainly gain some pity if that was what you were after, or a sense of being yourself on your own in the big bad world. I guess Chris was giving the impression that he was quite capable of looking after himself. Ron does more than just question Chris mercilessly. He shares his experiences and opinions in the eyes of someone who has lost, and how through the powerful prospect of forgiveness in all things, even towards himself, has led him towards this opinion in life, that it was worth living for. All in all, Ron hints the need for Chris to forgive his parents, even if it takes a long time to get there. It is better than carrying that resentment around, like he saw in the scene with the moose. However, like we saw throughout the movie, Chris's ideals stem from the belief that experiences and happiness are further afield from human relationships, where Ron's remark being to understand that there is a difference between stability and freedom, and how there needs to be a balance between them both. It seems Chris has gone from one extreme to the other, from a sheltered family unit in a materialistic universe, with society dictating the laws that are abided by him by his generation, towards a freedom with the silence of nature. Within this isolation, there is time to reflect and live in the moment, with the elements always against him. This choice has Chris perhaps being seen by society as an outsider, being ignored until it opens up to give him help within these pockets of people who live differently from his childhood. Upon reflection, if one really thinks about it, Chris, through his interactions with all the people down the road, Wayne, Tracy, Ron, Rainey and Jan, as well as many others we are not aware of, their stories can almost paint a picture of the many what-ifs that Chris could have chosen as a life. If their living was any way influential, which I believe it was, Chris would have understood their importance of meeting the way they did, and felt that their lives, and perhaps their love for him, were real and secure. He need not have found whatever he was looking for so drastically and without abandon. He had a choice, and what he chose was the unknown. I find this brave, and it's this journey into the wild that Chris, perhaps, truly found himself. If you enjoyed what was said, please follow me on Anchor and Spotify. Be kept in the loop for new episodes by following my Instagram. And if you have any questions, email me at twotakespodcast1@gmail.com. And as always, thanks for listening.